This is the Parents Who Think debate show, and today is episode 2 of 3 in the Should Smacking Be Banned in England and Northern Ireland debate. I'm Danusha Malina-Derben, and if you're new to Parents Who Think, nip back an episode to hear the start of this debate. If you do, you'll get to know guests and understand the dynamics of PWT debates. You'll also hear my 3 guests briefly share their life stories, sum up their views on the debate in 6 words, and discuss whether they consider their opinions predictable, progressive, or polarising. On the other hand, you don't need to do this to get the gist. I'll help you out. We've got 2 guests, Roma and Nicole, with self-defined progressive views. What's fascinating is that while they both consider their opinions are progressive ones, they don't agree on whether smacking should be banned. Roma is a loud yes to the ban and says her opinion is only progressive, not predictable, because she thinks there's a way to go before more people wake up and see that smacking should be banned. Nicole, our other progressive, is neither pro nor anti-banning. She sees her views as progressive because people hold simplistic views on this smacking ban topic. More on that in this episode. Now, Jo, my 3rd guest, sees her opinion as predictable because research shows that public opinion is skewed towards banning smacking in England and Northern Ireland. That's 2 clear yeses to banning smacking and a nuanced answer that it is a no unless changes are made. Roma and Nicole are both parent educators, by the way, while Jo works in leadership development, inclusion and diversity type strategy and training within organisations. All 3 parents were smacked as children. They're all older than 35, so that's not a big surprise, is it? Given the tendency for smacking to be routine back then, and even more than this, advised as part of parenting discipline. My background info on smacking in England and Northern Ireland covered how complex and multifaceted an issue it is, as it touches on fundamental questions about children's rights, parenting practices and parental rights, as well as societal norms. In the Dishing the Dirt segment, I shared my experiences of being smacked as a kid and smacking my children. I regret ever smacking my children, and I covered how I've worked on emotional regulation and also given up alcohol 5 years ago. Although I was a social drinker, I wanted this out of my life. This personal growth is part of my evolution as a parent and as a person with my own stuff carried through from childhood. My guests show great courage to publicly discuss this hard topic. I'm thankful to these parents for showing up with vulnerability in this episode, because knowing how other parents think and how they experience things is permission giving. It's a levelling experience to hear the behind the scenes, not just the front of house narratives. Is this debate done different? Let's see how. First, a quick recap from Nicole, Roma and Jo. Then we'll move on to hear guests get into the core of the debate in the Get Up on Your High Horse segment.
There becomes a bit of a conflict sometimes within the generations as to what is accepted and what isn't. And I find anyway, when I'm talking to people, that people of my parents' age, the ones that are saying smacking should become illegal are actually the ones that probably had much more of a trauma when they were children themselves. And that's lasted with them. And they say, no, I didn't want that. And actually, I don't think any child should go through that.
Again, there's this blurred line. And this is what I think is difficult in this debate topic, is there's somehow a line that it didn't do you any harm. But when does smacking or hitting become something else? And that's where that line is, for me, impossible to draw.
Smacking just leads to a greater level of anxiety, aggression in children, antisocial behaviour, And when these kids grow up, higher rates of crime, poorer mental health outcomes. And we know that actually the harsher punishments lead to the more extreme outcomes.
Our ideas about smacking have changed. Physical punishment was once the go-to typical way to dissuade kids from certain behaviours, and it was seen as one way to put in boundaries and discipline. You've said about the way that parents treat their children now, the changes, the generational understandings, cultural understandings, actually, about what childhood is, for instance, how we might behave better. But I also noticed that trauma is a word that is used a lot these days, isn't it? And in fact, a bit like abuse is used quite a lot. Now, smacking would be seen as, for some people, as abuse. I wonder, have you felt like smacking your kids or smacked them? Tough question, right?
Many times felt like it. Been very close to it. And as I said before, that I did smack.
In episode 1, she described an incident when she smacked one of her children to protect her other child.
I've struggled over the years. I'm not going to lie. I have really struggled over the years. So when my eldest was 2 years, 8 months, she fell out the cot, so we put her into a bed and we were back to 2 hours a night. And my ability to be able to function normally in any capacity was just stripped away. She'd scream, she'd be up all the night, she'd be wanting me there, she just wouldn't sleep. And at the time I was trying to run a business, so she needed to be in bed so I could actually do my job. And the amount of pressure as a self-employed person when you need your child to be asleep as well, that all builds up. And yeah, there was moments, and to the point where, and I'll be honest, I don't remember a lot of it. I think there was a lot of trauma for me around that point, and you block it out because it was a really hard time, and it led me to go to my GP in absolute pieces because I genuinely was actually afraid of what I might be capable of if I kept getting pushed. And it was a really scary place to be because I didn't recognize the person looking back at me in the mirror. It was like some crazy person, and I had no ability at all to cope with anything.
The inside experience of different parenting stages can feel traumatic. Many parents get to their edge where they worry what they might do. Here's what happened to Nicole.
And I went to my GP and I was just crying, and I couldn't say why I was there because I didn't really know. I just knew that it felt like I'd hit the end of a line. And if I didn't do something, I didn't know what, I just knew if I didn't do something, that I was worried that something bad could happen.
Roma tells me about some of her worst moments as a parent.
When my son was 3, that was the closest I got to smacking one of my children. My hand swung towards him, and somehow I was able to exert enough willpower. I really wanted to smack him. I was actually going to slap him in the face, which is quite extreme. And it was because he was refusing to get out of his car seat. So, it wasn't that he'd done anything really that wrong. He was just being quite defiant. I was pregnant and exhausted and just really wanted to get in the house, and I lost my rag. And I went to slap him, and just at the very last moment managed to draw my hand back away from his face. But that was pretty close. So I haven't been a smacker, but I've definitely handled my children too roughly. There's a really awful time where my daughter must have been about less than 2, and I was in a hurry to pick someone up from the station, and I was trying to get her to go in her car seat, and she was absolutely refusing. I don't know if you've ever had this with any of your kids where they just go rigid like a plank.
Yes.
She was really strong. I mean, you wouldn't imagine that you would lose a physical fight with a less than 2-year-old, but I was losing it, and I was trying to shove her into the car seat by pushing her little pelvis, which is kind of horrifying to remember. I did manage to calm myself and her down. I took her out and held her, and she cried, and I cried too. And I think eventually, when she was calmer, I managed to get her in.
This wasn't a one-off.
Yeah, it was quite common that I would be pushing or pulling or shoving my children around when I would get dysregulated. And that was definitely a result of how I was parented.
Jo grew up in a home environment that included physical violence between her parents. Here's me stating the bleeding obvious. This is therefore a really big topic for you.
Yes, surprisingly so. I hadn't given it much thought. I thought, my views aren't going to be tremendously strong. I've got an understanding and appreciation of what leads somebody to smack.
I had to ask Jo this. Have you felt like smacking?
Yes, I did. And worse at times, if an honest truth. I think there have been 2 points in my parenting life, well, a couple of points when it comes to my influence, my physical influence as a parent. And as a solo mum by choice, I'm the only parent. So in many respects, I'm the only one to absorb the anger and frustration. My daughter would be the only one in my environment to be at the end of any frustrations or anger I have. The first experience was one that I know only a few mums have possibly talked about, and that was when I was very sleep deprived. In my daughter's, she's only a few months old, and I hadn't had sleeps for many, many weeks. And it felt never ending, and she was crying yet again, or, colicky. And I picked her up one time, and because a lot of physical feelings of anger and frustration are felt in the hands. And it flashed over me just how much I could, for a flash of a second, understand how people could go to shake babies or squeeze them tighter than they should, because I felt it. And I put her down on the bed, and I left the house, and I went into my garden, and I screamed and shouted and said many, many, many swear words. And that was a scary moment for me. And I recognized just how intense those feelings could be.
Before we hear Jo's second time, let's talk sleep deprivation, because as she says, this is something that isn't aired much.
The thing that we've got to understand is we have babies, and we go into this with our eyes thinking they're wide open and realise that actually they'd been totally glued shut. We've been led on a really merry dance through our antenatal classes that newborn babies sleep all the time. No, they don't. And it's a short-term thing. It's a phase. And nobody is saying to people that this is something that could last for years and years. And when you're not sleeping, so when we've got 2 different types of sleep. We have this non-REM sleep, which is this really deep sleep, which is the physical side of us that is repairing. So the growth hormones are kicking in, our immune system's repairing itself. So that's like the really good stuff there. Then we have the REM sleep, which is where our brain is kind of going through things. So it's going through its memory consolidation. It's basically having a brain detox. And this is the part where our brain is getting us ready to be able to regulate our emotions. Now, what tends to happen is our little ones are up more in the second half of the night because it's a much lighter stage of sleep. So it's that point when we've not long gone to bed that they're moving into their lighter sleep. And people say, it's like they know when I've gone to bed. It's like they absolutely knew when I'd gone to bed. They were fine. They were slept until then. I've got into bed and they're up every hour. And the thing is, as an adult, if we're not getting that really important part of the sleep where our brain is getting a chance to repair, we then have no ability to regulate our emotions. And that's a biological thing. That's not somebody wanting to cause destruction or devastation with their child. That is somebody who literally has no ability because their brain is not getting that chance to repair. And it's the fact it coincides with our little ones being up all night as well. So it's just a bad mix.
Medical studies show that sleep deprivation or not getting sufficient sleep takes a toll in terms of mood, health, safety, and even longevity in all of us. Parents who have fragmented sleep experience higher levels of stress, and this is associated with difficulties regulating emotions.
When you're not sleeping as a parent and your brain isn't getting time to actually repair and you've got no ability to regulate your own emotions, we can't expect you to find a way to support your little one while they can't regulate their own emotions either, unless we do something to support you and teach you and give you strategies to help you calm down in those really difficult situations so you can support your little one. Rather than presuming that people can do that without any support, without any education, we need to actually change that and say, actually, we accept that we haven't put that in place. We haven't got that infrastructure.
Lack of support and education is at the heart of why Nicole is not a yes ban smacking in England and Northern Ireland. Sleep deprivation took Nicole and Jo to their edge. But Jo mentioned 2 points in her parenting that did this. Her next smacking experience came through advice from a friend.
And as my daughter grew up, and probably when she was about 5, and I was finding it incredibly frustrating, and I'd spoken to a good friend who I believe, in all honesty, is a very good parent. She is, and I've left my daughter with her, and I love her daughter and her son. And she had said in frustrating times when anger had overwhelmed her, she had smacked her daughter, and maybe it would work. Maybe it should be something that I might try.
Interesting advice. Notice Jo thinks her friend is a good parent.
I can't even remember what the behaviour was, but it triggered me so much. I was so angry, and I smacked my daughter. And I don't even know with what force I did it. But instead of what might typically be seen in some people, it wasn't fear that I saw. I did see some fear, but it turned into her reaction being escalating and her anger and behaviour getting worse. And I saw it in that moment for what it was, which was diminishing the relationship between me and her, and the trust and the close attachment she has to me. But that trust that she put in me to protect her and keep her safe, I was at that point no longer providing a safe space for her.
And how did that feel for you?
Very upsetting. It was upsetting for us both. When we'd both calmed down and I spoke to her about it, and I apologised and said, I am deeply sorry for that, and I will try never to do that again.
Jo's daughter's reaction wasn't what she expected.
Because what I've since discovered is she's matured. She's definitely neurodiverse, and she does have a fight response herself, which is incredibly upsetting to see. And I know when the brain flips, how co-regulating her emotions are so essential to helping her through those moments, and how having a safe space where she can be at all times is hugely important for her as a child, and for me to show as a parent and a person as well. Because I believe some of the ways I've tried to deal with my frustrations when she triggers me is identifying those triggers, but you can take them into any relationship. It's not just parent and child. It's how you deal with arguments in a relationship.
Each of my guests smacked. I've smacked. This episode isn't about the morality of smacking. None of us are pro-smacking. This debate is on, is it right to ban smacking in England and Northern Ireland? Now let's be straight. It seems obvious to ban it. 70 countries banned it already, including Wales, Scotland and Jersey. Why hasn't it happened? We're digging into the complexities of this apparent, clear-cut decision. We're uncovering nuance and opinion. Here's Roma.
The thing I want to say about this is that I have absolutely no judgment for a parent who smacks their children. We've all been there and had moments like this where we're completely beyond ourselves. And by the time it gets to that point, it's actually physiological. Your brain has been taken over. Your prefrontal cortex has been taken down, and you can't access any higher thought or willpower, and you're really just ruled by your wiring, which was, generally how you were treated as a child, and that takes over. But what I will say is there's a difference between defending your actions, which I think those who really argue for smacking, on some level, many of them seem to be defending their actions as a parent. And there's a kind of cognitive dissonance, and there are layers of protection in our psyche, because on some level, we know that when we smack our children, it feels inherently wrong and we need to justify it somehow. So some people really rationalize that. And actually, I think if we can just say it's okay that we sometimes lose it with our kids, it's not actually our fault. We're all doing our best. But that's a very different thing from outright condoning smacking.
Having compassion is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And not judging and recognizing we all get pushed to that edge. None of that is condoning it. But banning it, that's a different thing, isn't it? Making it criminal acts. And I'm curious what you think about how those prosecutions could possibly be deployed, what definitions we'd have around some of the grey areas. When you talk, for instance, about rough handling, my definition of rough handling won't be yours and ours won't be, Jane's down the road. I'm wondering about where's the line? What is it?
Well, that's a really good point, and I imagine it all needs defining. There are probably ways to break it down.
Legislation in countries that have already abolished corporal punishment differs. The definitions are not the same. For instance, the Supreme Court of Norway ruled in 2005 that a light, careful slap applied immediately after an offence was still allowed. Further legislation abolished this in 2010, and the current law is that any violence against children, including careful slaps, is prohibited. As this episode airs, corporal punishment is legal through tradition and an implicit common law justification defence to such charges for parents striking their children in the context of lawful correction, where the act is moderate and reasonable. Now that's England and Northern Ireland's law. The Children Act 2004 provides a statutory definition of immoderate by disallowing this justification for any act of punishment inflicting injuries or effects that amount to strangulation, wounding, actual bodily harm, or any act considered cruelty to persons under 16, in violation of the Children and Young Persons Act 1933 and described as visible bruising.
Well, I was going to say a lot of this in this debate is around the term reasonable chastisement and reasonable punishment in the UK law. And what is reasonable to me is definitely not reasonable to somebody else. As we know, we've all got very differing views. So this line is such a grey area. How can you say the term reasonable and expect people to have the same understanding of what reasonable is?
Reasonable punishment and reasonable chastisement is problematic for many.
I would say we need to remove the term reasonable and have complete clarity on there should be no punishment. There should be no physical punishment. And I hate the term punishment as well, generally, as I've heard it used and intertwined with the word consequences when what they're really meaning is punishment, with my daughter a lot, who is neurodiverse and has struggles at school.
Jo is rigid. There should be no physical punishments. Now, interestingly, despite Sweden being the world's first nation to outlaw all corporal punishment of children, it's estimated that at least 5% of Swedish children continue to be illegally smacked. The issue with reasonable as a concept is that it's dangerously vague. Professor Andrew Rowland, consultant paediatrician, says he's seen children who have been hit with a belt or blunt implement from the kitchen, like a spoon, or cables from a phone or laptop charger that's been used as a whip. For listeners who've not listened to the Parents Who Think debate on are we creating mollycoddled kids, you might enjoy it. You might want to go back and listen to it. Tanya, one of the parents who is a yes, we are creating mollycoddled kids, shares how she instills self-discipline and self-control into her 5 children. She talks about using a wooden spoon, not in moments of loss of control or anger, oh no, but rather when her children don't follow instructions or are defiant. Now, whether we agree or not, it's a privilege to hear why people do what they do, why we do what we do. Mixed in with her parenting account, Tanya takes us into her childhood memories of being beaten by angry caregivers.
I listened to that episode and I found some of it triggering.
Let's return to the vagueness of England and Northern Ireland's reasonable punishments and what my guest parents think.
But, it's just like any of the things that we have laws around. You're not allowed to drive a car unless you can do so safely. And that's something that you have to learn. And in the same way, we can learn not to lose it with our children. It is actually a skill issue, as my teenage son would say. And so while I, have absolute compassion for anyone in the moment who has lost it, in the longer term, if this is something that you are not addressing in yourself as a parent, I think there's work to be done. So one of the ways we can do this is through going over the unresolved or leftover issues we have from our own childhood. This requires a certain amount of self-work. It involves lifting out the hurt and the shame of being parented in a more autocratic style, which most of us were. And if you were, you're drastically more likely to be smacking your own children. It's just the way that our internal parenting software was installed.
It's a great way of putting it. So our default, really, of what we know.
Yes, exactly.
The operating system.
I mean, if you don't consciously lay down the operating system of your choice, you'll go to the default one, which is the one that your parents used.
Here's Nicole on how she laid down her own parent operating system. This is the deeply personal account of her process. She knew if she hadn't taken action to get help, that something bad might happen.
And that's when I got the initial counselling call. Then they put me onto anger management, which obviously we now call CBT. So I did an anger management course, which sort of helped a little bit in the sense that it gave me some strategies on how to calm down in difficult situations. And it helped give me a better understanding of why we do things in the moment. But it didn't fix it because we were still getting 2 hours of sleep a night. It didn't fix the problem, which was I was not able to rest enough for my brain to function well.
Counselling and anger management CBT helped Nicole a bit, but didn't sort the source problem, sleep.
And it was when I went and did the Incredible Years course, which is like a 10-week parenting course, that I started to really understand it.
She'd been practicing as a sleep consultant by this point for over a year, but was desperate herself.
I was in a situation where I could not get my own to sleep, and I just felt like a complete failure. I felt like such a fraud. But actually, when I did this course, I realized that from about 20 months upwards, you cannot treat sleep the same because the child changes. This transition that they go through, they transform virtually overnight from being a baby to this toddler that has found all these buttons to press and is loving jumping on them, and it's just so overwhelming. And it was only getting a really good education for me on behaviors and parenting and understanding children, the brain and the emotions, and how to communicate effectively with children that started to really change it. And I started to lay really good foundations at home on the behaviors and the communications and my understanding of children, which made a huge difference. And from that, I was then able to start fixing the sleep, but I was never going to fix the sleep if I didn't actually have all the other stuff in place first.
Let's pause here. Nicole is saying that she couldn't get the sleep sorted without this foundational work. Here's why.
We can't expect people to just know how to do it. I thought I knew what I was doing. I'd studied sleep, I'd practiced it, I was teaching other people. I'd been at it for over a year. I even paid the person who did my training, who trained me, to help me with my child's sleep. And it didn't work because it's not about sleep, it's all the other stuff. And unless you hit rock bottom and you go to your doctor begging for help and you know what it is that you're actually looking for and asking for, there's nothing. There's no education that is standard for helping support parents on that transition.
I asked Nicole what she meant by the other stuff.
Right. So when they're babies, everything's much more in your control, in the sense that they're not answering back. They don't lash out really at you. You can put them down in their cot, you can sit with them, you can support them, you can have physical contact, and you're not having your hair ripped out and you're not being punched, and they're not going through these big emotions themselves as a child because they're a baby. And actually the developments they're going through are totally different. They're learning to roll, they're learning to crawl, they're learning to stand, they're learning to walk. It's a very different thing. So they're more gross motor skills. And then we get to this other bit where the baby becomes a toddler and a child.
The baby to toddler transitional stage is Nicole's focus.
This is the bit where actually they start to realize that they've got a little bit of control over situations. And they like that and they feel quite powerful, but actually that's also very scary. And in that moment, actually, I can do this and I'm going to get this, but actually, where are my boundaries? Where's my safe space? And sometimes as a parent, we don't really know how to deal with that. We just kind of go, oh, they're pushing us. I've said no. Oh, they've pushed me so far, I'm just going to say yes.
Toddlers go through extraordinary speedy development, learning to talk, testing boundaries, making a grab for control. They also have big feelings and aren't yet able to express these. Well, they do express them, but their frustration can come out as anger.
What we might see as an angry child that's lashing out at us, and actually is probably just a little child that is going through something that they don't know how to communicate. And as a parent, unless we understand that, we then don't know how to manage that.
Supporting children's developmental leaps asks us as parents to be in control of ourselves as adults. I mean, that might seem an obvious point. Roma has lots to say on this.
So what we're trying to do is actually eliminate being taken by surprise, being hijacked effectively by the limbic system of your brain, so that, you're actually more in control of yourself more of the time. And that's what children experience as having a safe pair of hands in charge. That's what our children are needing most of all, actually, is an adult who is most of the time well regulated and thinking well and making good decisions. And this is something that we can work towards.
Roma's children aren't toddlers, they're teens. another notorious stage where frustrations between children and parents collide.
I've worked so much on lifting out the hurt from my own childhood that at this point in my parenting, and my kids are teenagers now, I very rarely even use an off tone with them or say something blamey or passive aggressive or belittling. It almost never happens. I occasionally slip up with that, but most of the time I've got myself enough that I'm speaking to them very respectfully in a straightforward way. I think parents would ask if we are not using corporal punishment or threats or bribery to coerce or control or motivate our children or control their behavior, what do we do instead? And that is a really good question. And I think really that's just a question of being informed, having tools at your disposal, because actually we can set limits without any harshness or manipulation of any sort. And this is really what we call authoritative parenting. It's the style of parenting that research shows leads to the best outcomes in not only children's behaviours, but also their longer term well-being.
Lifting out hurt from our own childhood, being informed, and having tools at our disposal are emerging themes. But there's an avenue I want to take us down right now. It's about neurodiverse children and neurodiverse parents.
I don't believe that neurodiverse children should be necessarily always treated differently. I believe there should be a kind of standard that's set for all children. So the lowest common denominator should be for everyone a neurodiverse kind of approach that works.
Say a little bit more about that for people who aren't raising neurodiverse children.
So there is some approaches that I believe, such as when my daughter has a meltdown, what works to get out of her kind of brain flips, as they refer to it, and she may come out of her rational brain. And this is a developmental thing that can take years to develop. So at her age, it's developmentally normal still for children not to be able to, for example, understand when anger or the fight mode or causing aggression or feeling anger in your hands and those feelings in your body, to understand them and feel them coming on. They just come on. And in a typically neurotypical world, we'll see it was bad behavior. So she did something, she tore something off a wall, or she may have grabbed another child by the arm or grabbed their hair or something like that in this fit of anger. But what has happened is the rational brain is actually just switched off. So neurotypically, there is consequences to or punishment to this behavior. Whereas what I found through learning basically is with neurodiverse children, in those moments you have to lean in, show them and tell them they are safe so that they can get back into their logical brain. Mm-hmm. And so that they can begin to return back physically, physiologically, emotionally to their natural normal state.
Yeah, they're regulated.
They need adults role modeling to them how to co-regulate. My view was schooling, parenting, and there could be more to help parents do this, is to understand that how we do that for everyone, regardless of whether they're neurodiverse or not, how we help and demonstrate and role model as adults to children how to regulate themselves. And that we're there for them. Therefore, that should be the common denominator, not we only do that for neurodiverse children.
Roma talked about tone earlier. I flipped from neurodiverse children to neurodiverse parents and asked her this. What would you say, given that children need a safe pair of hands and you're talking about regulation and tone, what about parents who are neurodiverse, where impulsivity can be all part and parcel of that cognitive profile?
When you're neurodivergent, you are much more likely to be stressed than a neurotypical person because you're already on a back foot. Same if you are disabled, same if you have any of the other forms of oppression on your plate. And yes, of course, this makes your work harder and it's deeply unfair.
We're talking about some of the variables at play when we consider people's abilities to weather the strains of developmental growth, the leaps, the inherent stretches that children must make emotionally, physically, and more as they grow up. Parents are also experiencing their own evolvement.
But the same goes really for anybody, that we can access a less stressed nervous system. It takes some work. And for some people, that's going to be a bigger piece of work for sure. I mean, that's something I have a lot of personal experience of. We're all neurodivergent in my family, and I've been disabled with a chronic condition for the last 5 years. And that has had a huge impact on my parenting. It's meant that, you know, I've had very, very little to give my children, and we've had to adapt. And you just do your best, you know, with a big dose of compassion. And sometimes you have to let go of your ideals. Maybe you'll only 80% get there or 60% get there.
But in relation to smacking, the sentence, you just have to do your best, isn't going to wash, is it?
Right.
If it's banned is what I mean.
If it's banned, it's a really fair point. And yeah, maybe there are groups of people who need greater understanding around why they're being driven to certain behaviours. Absolutely. And how would you warrant for that? It's a really good question. I'd be curious to know how this is playing out in other countries where they have banned smacking. Because I think really the crucial thing is that there's a sort of official line to this. You know, it's almost, it's less important what's actually happening de facto, and more important that we are making a stand for children's well-being, that we are providing a gold standard expectation.
I looked for information about the ways countries differentiate between parents in smacking prosecutions, but couldn't find any granular detail anywhere. I mean, this wasn't a surprise. Here's Nicole wading in on this important aspect. Oh, and by the way, I had no idea my guests with opposing viewpoints would end up talking so much about the conditions that lead to smacking.
It's not about saying that that person should or shouldn't smack. It's accepting that this person is going through something, that somebody else who might be neurotypical, that doesn't have any health problems, that had the unicorn baby that slept pretty well or had a few dodgy moments and things that they had a bit of a rough time with, but hasn't had that chronic sleep deprivation for potentially years. That person is in no position to judge another person who is going through something totally different to them, because how can anybody know what's going on in somebody's life and what they're feeling and how they are going to react?
And of course, judging is at the heart of making smacking illegal. I mean, that's the whole point. There will be judges, making decisions about very individual situations, I'm guessing, highly different from parent to parent, family to family. So that's a really interesting, it's grey. That's what people are saying at the moment, isn't it? That it's a grey area. Tell me what you think needs to be put in place rather than banning smacking.
We need a better support system right from the beginning. So when I went on the Incredible Years course, they're paying people to run these courses. Why can't we do what I've done? Why can't we literally take that information and turn it into something where we can self-teach? And it becomes a standard thing that's on the government website. We all have our portals to our childcare accounts and all these things. Why can't we have it that actually we log into these portals and it's our area and we have everything that we need at the points that we need it. It's like when you're pregnant, you don't really want to know what's going to hit when they're 2, but actually from about 12 to 15 months, you could probably do with starting to get a bit of an understanding, because you've got through those previous 12 months. And actually there's a lot happened in that time that you wouldn't have been in any place to be able to take that information in. So why not actually have something that literally guides them right the way through their journey, all in a portal that's all on a government site that everybody has access to, and it doesn't even cost. Let the government put this out. Let's educate really simply and make it the norm. So yeah, let's bring it all together. Let's put it all in one place. Some really good stuff, really good evidence-based information, not opinion, evidence-based information with real coping strategies, with experts that can talk about certain topics. I can literally picture a portal right now that leads off into certain areas. If you're struggling with this, get help here. If you're struggling with that, you can go and find out more here. I can see it all. And we could put that at everybody's fingertips.
Let's educate parents rather than criminalise them is Nicole's message. Roma wants to hold parents to a gold standard of parenting, where children's well-being is centred. Now, Jo wants parents to put in the work of equipping themselves emotionally and mentally, rather than smacking their kids. Now, she hired a sleep consultant when her daughter was 8 months old, after a period of acute sleep deprivation. She brings us full circle.
Luckily, I had the money to support me to be able to do that, and it transformed my parenting journey for the first year of my daughter's life. So I do think there needs to be far more help for parents on things like parenting courses. When you do NCT, you get all prepared for the birth, but nowhere talks about this somehow hidden shame of the anger and the physical feelings you can feel with sleep deprivation. And this is something that I would love to see more parents be taught about, so they can role model it to their children.
But the fact is that's not in place.
No, it's not.
What I really mean when I say it's not in place is that it's not in place unless you've the money to afford this. It's not routinely in place for all. But a smacking ban, if it becomes law, will affect all families.
I know parents who smack who I believe their kids and their family are in a happy home, and they do enforce smacking.
Jo, let me stop you. How could it be a happy home if the child is being smacked?
So there is a conundrum there.
An underlying question in this debate is, how do we quickly change a cultural normality? Parents who were smacked as children and who smack their own, however occasionally, may find it difficult to adjust to a change in law, especially when these punishments happen behind closed doors. I hope you join me alongside my guests, Roma, Nicole and Jo, to find out what they think will happen if and when smacking becomes illegal in England and Northern Ireland. Now that's in next week's episode. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Parents Who Think. I'd love to welcome you over at the Parents Who Think Substack, where we've developed a lovely community there. We also have our YouTube channel called, Parents Who Think. Now, I've really noticed that people are starting to drop comments there, which is great. Thanks for being such a fab supporter of the show, and remember to tune in for the next instalment of this debate in a week's time. Take care, everyone.